Hi, I'm Donovan, and I'm going to continue in my manuscript six, Sex and Sacrament. Now on chapter 4, and up to now we've gone through an introduction to the book overall, and we're in part 1, which is all on prayer. We've talked about mental prayer, vocal prayer, and prayer of recollection, self-reflection, self-examination. We've done some guided prayer practices with Lectio Divina, and we've done a sort of self-examination prayer a couple times. I've shared some other guided practices from other traditions and things I do myself. These are all things I do myself. But anyway, so today we're on prayer of contemplation, which is chapter 4, prayer of quiet contemplation, contemplative meditation. So today I'm going to cover the first 2 sections of this chapter. It's a shorter chapter than the last 2. How contemplation interconnects with the other forms of prayer that we've talked about so far. The most common or ordinary kind of prayer we've been exploring so far is sometimes called mental prayer, at least in Christian traditions. And this is how many people in many prayer traditions normally pray, trying to discover more about God by being mentally focused. Typo there. Mindful, attentive, consciously thinking of words communicated to God, sometimes out loud, often silently. In prayer of recollection, the one we did last time, the more conversational and self-reflective form of this mental prayer, we try to focus not just on who God is, but also who we are. Remembering always that we are forever connected with God. God is always present with us. In both forms of mental prayer, the sort of talking to God or looking within ourselves, we're just trying to stay mindfully connected with God in whatever ways we can. In mental prayer, we try not to address God while thinking of other things. We're really making an effort to focus our thoughts only on God. In prayer of recollection, that second form that we tried yesterday, we're trying to find God by looking within ourselves, experiencing peace, giving our inner selves completely to God while also opening ourselves up as if to receive and more fully experience God's loving presence with us as a gift. As the Spanish mystic Teresa of Avila described this prayer experience, the soul collects together all the faculties, all the senses, and the senses of the mind, the abilities of the mind, and enters within itself to be with its God, shutting itself up within this little heaven of the soul, wherein dwells the maker of heaven and earth. So again, by the other forms of prayer we looked at so far, we use words and we use looking within to kind of see God inside of ourselves and what God has done and how God is present with us. The main way that prayer of quiet, the one we start on tonight, differs from these forms of mental prayer. It's also called contemplation or sometimes just meditation. The way that it really differs from those other forms of prayer we just reviewed is that it's less active. Without all that effort of spoken or silent words, questions, and self-reflection, we quietly just experience perpetual peace and tranquility of the soul, centering ourselves in this time of rest with God. Through ongoing practice of this quiet prayer of rest in God over time, our love for God and our ability to channel God's love to others grows. A state we can't attain through our own efforts. In fact, Teresa even calls it a supernatural state. The point is really with this, that's pretty lofty words, but the point is we can't make ourselves all by ourselves into a channel of God's love unconditionally and completely all the time. But by building a habit of resting in God and just letting ourselves be in God's presence, that can start to happen more naturally because it's God doing it in us. It's not us forcing it. That may not make sense when I just try to describe it in words, but if you get a chance to practice that in any of the many different traditions that practice it with a lot of, especially now during the pandemic, there's so many people hosting those kinds of experiences online to be together and share that. And we're also going to practice some as guided practice here too. So I will share what I can a little bit in that direction in a couple of nights. So God's love, when we have this habit of this quiet prayer of rest, God's love starts to overflow into our actions instead of being forced by our own thoughts or our laborious efforts. We don't have to choose between being a blissful devotee or the busy worker as we serve God, when our life is one that's kind of steeped in this prayer, because we get to be both. Both ways are channels for God's love in action. As the mystics put it, Mary and Martha are working in unison. And for those who don't know that story, that's a story of two friends of Jesus in the Gospels, sisters. One wanted to sit at his feet and show him devotion by just loving him and contemplating, being in his presence, resting in his presence, really. And another one wanted to show her love by working in the kitchen and preparing food for them. And the point of this prayer is really that, again, both of those are ways of being mindful, meditating, being connected. It's not a competition. They're both good, and they're both channels of God's love. And again, in the prayer of quiet, both of these things can be happening. We can carry that quiet rest in God even while we're doing things. When we pray this way, we can actually let go of trying to force our way to a connection with God, trusting that with little or no effort on our part, we're like a baby nursing at a mother's breast, whether we feel an emotional high or not. So we may not feel always in prayer of quiet that connection, but it's an act or a surrender, sort of trusting that I know, God, you're with me, nourishing me, even if I feel dry, even if I feel distracted. I'm the baby in this equation, and you're the parent giving me the milk. We simply are loved, and are nourished by God without needing to understand how or why in this kind of prayer. So it's a very surrendered prayer. These are just different ways to connect. The form of prayer we use isn't important. One isn't better than another. All prayer connects us with the presence of God. As Teresa said, we all must journey to the same fountain of living water, though we may not all do so in the same way. All the time and efforts we offer in prayer in whatever way we can be our gift back to God of the time and ability that God has first given to us, whatever the result. Another thing a lot of different meditation and contemplation traditions teach is let go of the outcome. It doesn't really matter what happens. This is really a time to just trust, an experience of trusting that all time is God's time anyway. So whatever time we're sharing with God, I'll just quote Teresa here. Since we've resolved to devote to God this very brief period of time, only a small part of what we spend upon ourselves and upon people who are not particularly grateful to us for it, let us give it to God freely, with our minds unoccupied by other things, and entirely resolved never to take it back again, whatever we may suffer through trials, annoyances, or aridities. Let me realize that this time is being lent to me and is not my own. So again, it's a surrender of time to God, regardless of whether it feels sweet and juicy or not. At any, it's not always an emotional high. Sometimes it is, but sometimes it's not. So sometimes it's just the commitment or the faithfulness of showing up and being present with God, and giving that time and just building that habit and massaging that connection that we have with God. This next section is called Introduction to Contemplative Meditation. Though few outside of a monastic life or retreat setting may get to experience it, sometimes, it depends what tradition you're in. And now that we're in the pandemic, there's so many more online chances to experience prayer, quiet, and contemplation. But anyway, it may be, I should probably need to rephrase that. Yeah, I'll work on that later. This prayer of quiet, more commonly known simply as contemplation, was the favorite of Teresa of Avila, who's usually considered the leading Christian expert on this form of prayer, along with her student Juan de la Cruz or John of la Crosse, who lived in the 1500s, late 1500s. They defined contemplation not as the way we communicate with God, but rather as the way God communicates with us directly, without images or ideas, often through loving, direct, intuitive, silent presence. So this is a much more intuitive form of prayer, and it's more us noticing that God is communicating with us rather than us reaching out to God as if God's not already there. Since faith in God is always personal and relational, in contemplative prayer, we're responding to one who awakens love and who gives us all that we have and are. Our attitude in this quiet prayer will be one of listening, responding, attentiveness, and generous surrender. What Juan de la Cruz or John of the Cross called spiritual nakedness. In contemplative prayer, the soul experiences peace and rest in God's presence, letting go of intellect by avoiding distracting mental noise, even the words of spiritual readings and guided meditations. So again, there's nothing wrong with spiritual readings and using words in meditative prayer. Sometimes our soul is just tired. I won't even say soul, but sometimes sometimes some of us are tired of words, and we just want to let go and rest in God's presence. So this is just saying that kind of prayer. This is okay too. It's a good thing to do. You don't have to be wordy like I'm being right now to feel connected to God. Prayer of quiet instead waters or nourishes our lives as if God's presence is a stream running through our very being, irrigating our inner self. I'm going to just change a word here where I have been changing these, the impersonal way I once had this written, and feeling more connected myself using more connected language. So let me go back again. Prayer of quiet instead waters or nourishes our lives as if God's presence is a stream running through our very being, irrigating our inner self. In this quiet practice of prayer, the soul must empty itself of self in order to be filled with God. The more ordinary wordy stages of prayer are good too, and they can be a conversation with God that help us grow into experiencing moments of meditation, a little quieter moments, and then this extended quiet contemplation, a loving and simple faith that sometimes feels pleasant. Although there are times in ongoing contemplative life when we may feel growing pains, a negation of self, and a deep longing for God. Times when feeling separate from God is like a dark night of the soul. So just sharing that, kind of looking ahead to something we'll get to a little bit later, but just trying to be honest that if contemplation doesn't feel warm and fuzzy all the time, this doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. Everybody that's written about or shared about a long life of habitual contemplative prayer has talked about there are times that feel very dry, that feel very lonely, that feel very sad. So prayer isn't different than other parts of human life. It seems to have the same kind of highs and lows, and that's normal. And that doesn't mean don't do it. It's still a good way to connect. So contemplation, this quiet way of prayer, is not just an activity, but it may grow into a whole way of life, which brings, as this is from John of the Cross now, which brings in its train, following long after it, all the virtues, increases all the soul's potentialities, and may ultimately lead to transformation in God through love. So the point is, as we practice this, it becomes a way of life that we become maybe increasingly connected to God and really start to reach our potential and even become entirely transformed through being this habitually connected to God's love. To start with the mentally focused forms of prayer we tried earlier, and then seek a progressively more contemplative or quiet experience of prayer, a person must pass from an initial state of disorder along the way of faith to God, the goal of every human being. And again, that's John of the Cross. And what again, I know it's when you're not reading it, especially, it's a little bit $50 words there, but the reason I liked that quote, okay, I just want to share that I like the fact that he is very upfront that when we first try to be quiet when we pray and just be quiet and still and rest in God, disorder. There's a lot of mental noise. It's not easy. It can be chaotic. And that's normal. And he's talking about over time, if what we're seeking is to be one with God, to be interconnected with God, then it's something that we may experience more over time as we make time for it and spend time on that connection. In other words, the goal of contemplative prayer is not just inner peace for ourselves. And that's with the point. That was the other thing. He talks about how God is the goal of every human being. His point there, it's not just feeling good is the goal of every human being. So the goal of contemplative prayer is not just inner peace, just so I can feel better, but it's rather to love God, others, and ourselves completely, fully, without reservation. Some human effort is still involved here in this stage of prayer, especially at the beginning. As before, actively studying sacred texts, the lives of spiritual teachers, any other kind of aid to prayer and imitation of those whose faith we admire is very helpful, especially as we're learning how to quiet ourselves, as we're preparing for that time. All those things can be helpful. Even so, this form of prayer is not practiced or experienced as easily as those that use words, at least not for most people. So, to experience the prayer of quiet is a grace, a gift from God. The good news in that, for those of us who struggle to pray or meditate, is that we can be gentle and patient with ourselves if we don't happen to experience this God given gift of inner peace and perfect love when we pray. So just because you set aside a time to have some quiet with God and your intention is to rest in God, it doesn't necessarily mean it's going to happen that way. And I'm suggesting, for me, it's good news to find out that many other people through the centuries in every tradition of prayer and meditation have shared that over and over again. It's very consistent. It seems that most human beings who try it have some struggle with it sometimes. So it's okay, and we can be gentle with ourselves about that. It's not necessarily our fault. Many traditions tell us that if you manage to receive that moment where you feel connected to God and you really are one with God, that's a gift. Just say thank you. But if you don't receive that gift, don't throw a tantrum about it. It's okay. Just keep showing up. If instead our minds wander, as they usually will, we can simply return to the ordinary use of our mind's own effort, as described in the other methods of prayer that we've talked about and tried so far. So if I've really got monkey mind, I can think something, I can do a body scan, that's kind of a form of recollection. I can notice my breath, that's kind of a form of recollection. We can use our mind to sort of corral the senses a little bit. That's drawn from another tradition, but it, yeah. So the other tools that we have, use the tools that work in the time that you have. One way many people have found helpful to prepare ourselves to receive an experience of quiet, intimate prayer or contemplation is the practice of breath prayer. And there's a particular Christian version of this, Eastern Orthodox, it comes from the Eastern tradition, called hesychasm. And it's becoming, it does involve a little bit of words initially to enter into it. The goal is really that to become so habituated to prayer that it's like breathing. So you kind of start with some very simple words and notice your breath in and your breath out. And maybe, as you'll see when we do the guided practice, when we're breathing in, we're thinking of just a word or two. When we're breathing out, we're thinking of just a word or two. And we continue to do that. So initially thinking about it, I'm breathing in, I'm saying these words, I'm breathing out, I'm saying those words. We keep doing it until it just it becomes reflexive, just like breathing itself, which is involuntary. Likewise, our mind kind of following the breath, and then coming to a point where we don't even need the words that we've been thinking of, that we're just observing that connection with God that we have, or maybe we're able to just let go of thoughts and words entirely and just experience rest with God, trusting that God is with us in that experience. Many different traditions teach something like that. Because my training has been in the Christian tradition, and because I have deep concern after a couple of decades of journeying with young Christians in traditions where they were told that they couldn't meditate, or that was something that was dangerous. It's really been important to me to share a message that historically Christians have had their own experiences and practices of these kinds of prayers and forms of meditation. So this is why we're going to explore a Christian one, so that those who are Christian who think that they weren't allowed to meditate, or that their tradition didn't have that practice, so that if you are a Christian, or if you know someone who is, they can have their own. They can have something that maybe, I hope, will feel safe to them, because it is grounded in words from within their own tradition, and it's been taught and preserved by people in their own tradition. And many of us also practice something like this in other traditions. So it's not a competition. I just keep thinking of that, like, much like Teresa said, we're all looking for the living water. We all get to there in different ways, maybe, but anyway. So yeah, so I'm gonna share about hesychasm, but if those who know about mindful breathing or mindful meditation with breath, that'll seem pretty familiar. And then the other thing that it'll be in the next chapter, but I'll also talk about walking meditation. And again, for the sake of Christians who might have been taught that, oh, I can't do something like that, that's not part of my tradition, we're going to be I will share about prayer labyrinth, and I have it in the appendices. If anybody wants these, I have been given permission to share guidelines for how to create a prayer labyrinth out of rope in any space, and got photographs of when we did this at the time when I taught these chapters and these meditation practices in a church. It was a peace church. Yeah, so, and I've done that with a lot of students in a lot of different contexts. And so, I'll just share a little bit about that. So there's different ways we can be quiet with God, looking at our breath, noticing our walking. These practices will be explored as ways to let go, at least in part. I don't know why I made air quotes. That wasn't in quotes. We'll explore those as ways to let go, at least in part, the intensity of focus on our own mental prayer efforts, so that we let God. In other words, we just notice that we're receiving God's love, resting in resting in God mentally, emotionally, and spiritually, like a contented child in the arms of their loving parent, or like lovers after a passionate embrace, like an afterglow. So that's where I'm going to stop tonight. And I hope tomorrow to get through at least section 3, maybe sections 3 and 4. And then in 2 nights, we should be able to get to the guided practice of a breathing prayer that has some words from the Christian traditions. I'll share several different options for that before we do the breathing prayer. And with that, thank you. And I will pick this back up tomorrow.